Joao had always been different from the other kids in his neighborhood. While they played video games or hung around after school, Joao spent every free moment with a soccer ball at his feet. The streets of their small, worn-out neighborhood were his training ground. His shoes were often falling apart, the seams barely holding, but Joao didn't mind. The ball danced between his feet like magic, and in his mind, he was playing for one of the great teams, Santos, Palmeiras, or maybe even a club overseas, like Barcelona. Each day, Joao would practice on his own, kicking the ball against the wall of the small house he lived in with his family. The sound of the ball thudding against the cracked brick wall was a familiar background to the household. His mother would often look at him from the kitchen window, her eyes full of quiet pride. But there was always a tension, a sharpness in the air whenever his father, Francisco, was home. Francisco had lived a hard life, one that had beaten down his spirit over time. He had once had dreams too, but they had been crushed under the weight of bills, hard labor, and a family to support. Now, his hands were calloused from years of construction work, and his heart was hardened by the struggles of making ends meet. To him, Joao's dreams of soccer were just that, dreams. And dreams, in Francisco's mind, didn't pay the bills. "You're wasting your time with that ball, Joao," Francisco would say whenever he caught his son practicing. "One day, you'll have to grow up and face reality." Joao would nod, but his heart didn't believe those words. To him, soccer was the only thing that made him feel alive. It was the only place where he didn't have to think about the weight of responsibility or the disappointment in his father's voice. Out there on the street, with the ball at his feet, Joao was someone else. He was a star. Despite his father's constant disapproval, Joao's passion for soccer never faded. He practiced harder each day, driven by an inner fire that not even Francisco's harsh words could extinguish. But the lack of his father's support hurt. Deep down, Joao wanted nothing more than to make Francisco proud. To hear him say just once, "I believe in you." Still, the divide between them grew wider with each passing day. Francisco had long since given up on dreams, and he wanted Joao to do the same. "It's time to start thinking about your future," he would say, his voice stern. "You're old enough to start helping out around here. Soccer won't put food on the table." Joao knew that times were tough. He saw the worry lines etched into his mother's face and felt the cold emptiness in the refrigerator when the groceries ran low. But even so, the idea of giving up soccer felt like losing a part of himself. There were days when Joao would sneak away to watch the older boys play in the neighborhood tournaments. He'd stand on the sidelines, his eyes wide with admiration, studying their every move. One day, that would be him. He just knew it. He could feel it in his bones. But knowing that his father didn't believe in him cast a shadow over that dream, like a dark cloud that refused to let the sun shine through. Joao's one saving grace was Zé Carlos, the local coach. Zé had noticed Joao's talent early on and often pulled him aside after neighborhood games to give him pointers. "You've got something special, Joao," Zé would tell him. "Keep working at it, and who knows where you'll go." But no matter how many encouraging words he received from his coach, the only approval Joao craved was his father's. Yet, each time he thought he might be close to gaining Francisco's respect, it slipped through his fingers, like trying to hold on to water. Joao's mind was constantly torn between the reality his father saw and the dream that burned inside of him. He knew the road wouldn't be easy, but no matter how hard things got, one thing was clear. He wasn't ready to give up on his dream. Not yet. Even if that dream seemed impossible in the face of his father's disappointment. And so, every day, Joao laced up his battered shoes and went out to practice. He kicked the ball against the wall, dribbled around invisible defenders, and replayed the scenes of his future over and over in his mind. Even if he was the only one who believed in it, the dream still lived. Every Saturday, Joao's heart raced with excitement. It was game day in the neighborhood, and even though these were just small local matches to him, they felt like the World Cup. The games took place in a dusty field on the edge of town, where kids from all over would gather to play. Joao's team wasn't anything special, just a bunch of friends who loved the game, but together they had heart. And sometimes that was all that mattered. One Saturday morning, Joao laced up his worn-out shoes, grabbed his tattered ball, and ran out the door before Francisco could remind him of all the real work he should be doing. His father was already out working a construction job, which meant Joao could escape for a few precious hours without the weight of his disappointment hanging over him. When Joao arrived at the field, Zé Carlos was already there, blowing his whistle to get the kids moving. Zé was more than just a coach. He was a father figure to many of the boys in the neighborhood. He had an eye for talent, and though the resources in their small community were limited, Zé made the most of what they had. Joao and his friends started the game, and as usual, he quickly became the center of attention. He had a natural talent that set him apart. His footwork was quick, his passes sharp, and his determination unmatched. With every goal, Joao felt a spark of hope flare up inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he could make something of himself through soccer. Zé watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed and a thoughtful look on his face. He had been keeping an eye on Joao for a while now. There was something about the way the boy played, his passion, his drive. Zé had seen plenty of talented kids over the years, but Joao was different. He didn't just play with his feet, he played with his heart. After the game ended, Zé called Joao over. "You're improving, Joao. I can see you've been working hard." Joao smiled, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "I try, coach. I practice every day." Zé nodded, but there was a seriousness in his voice when he spoke next. "Listen, kid, you've got something special. You're not like the other boys out here. If you keep at it, I really think you could go far." For a moment, Joao felt a surge of pride. It was the kind of validation he so desperately craved. But then, just as quickly, his father's words came crashing back into his mind. "Soccer won't put food on the table." "I don't know, coach," Joao said, his voice quieter now. "My dad, he doesn't think soccer is a good idea. He says I should focus on more important things. Work, helping the family, you know?" Zé Carlos crouched down, so he was eye level with Joao. "Your dad's a good man. He just wants what's best for you. But sometimes parents don't always see the whole picture. What they think is best might not be what makes you happy." Joao looked down at the ground, his mind racing. He loved soccer more than anything, but he didn't want to disappoint his father. There was always this heavy feeling inside him, like he was being pulled in two directions. Zay patted him on the shoulder. "You don't have to decide right now. But remember this, you've got talent, Joao. And talent like yours doesn't come around every day. Keep working, keep dreaming. Who knows where it could take you?" Joao nodded, but the uncertainty in his heart remained. It was hard to believe in his dream when the most important person in his life didn't. As the weeks went by, Joao kept practicing, kept playing, but always with that shadow hanging over him. The games were a welcome escape, but they couldn't erase the reality waiting for him at home. Every evening, when Francisco returned from work, the tension in the house grew thicker. "You've been out playing soccer again, haven't you?" Francisco would ask, not bothering to hide his disapproval. Joao would just nod, not trusting himself to say anything more. What could he say? That soccer was the only thing keeping him sane, that it was the one place where he didn't feel like a disappointment. Francisco, as always, would just shake his head. "One day, you'll understand, Joao. Life isn't a game." But for Joao, soccer wasn't just a game. It was his life. Even with the encouragement from Zé Carlos and the cheers of his teammates, Joao felt the weight of his father's expectations pressing down on him. It was like carrying a heavy bag of cement on his back every time he stepped onto the field. The more he played, the more he wanted to prove his worth. Not just to his coach or his friends, but to Francisco. But how could he make his father understand? How could he get Francisco to see that soccer wasn't just some childish dream? It was a part of who Joao was, and giving it up felt like tearing away a piece of his soul. Yet, the more he tried to prove himself, the more distant his father seemed to grow. The day was coming when Joao would have to make a choice: follow his dream or follow the path his father had laid out for him. The final whistle blew, and Joao stood frozen in the middle of the dusty soccer field, his heart sinking. His team had lost. The scoreboard read 2-1, and their opponents, a local team that had always been a step ahead, were celebrating wildly on the sidelines. Joao wiped the sweat from his brow, his chest heaving from exhaustion. He had given everything, but it wasn't enough. His teammates started to gather around, some patting him on the back, others just staring at the ground in silence. There were no words to express how gutted they all felt. Joao had been the heartbeat of the team, making pass after pass, fighting for every ball. He even had a chance to tie the game in the last minute, but the shot had bounced off the post. Now, as he watched the other team celebrating, Joao felt a heavy knot form in his stomach. He hated losing, but more than that, he dreaded what was waiting for him at home. This wasn't just another game. This was his shot to prove to his father that soccer wasn't a waste of time, that he could be someone, that he could make something of himself. With his head hung low, Joao slowly gathered his things and walked off the field. His heart felt heavier with each step. The weight of the loss wasn't just about the game. It was about everything else that came with it. He had failed today, not just on the field, but in his mind. He had failed in proving his worth to his father. As he neared his house, he could already feel the tension building in his chest. His father's voice echoed in his mind, replaying over and over again. Soccer won't put food on the table. It's just a waste of time. Joao opened the door quietly, hoping to slip into his room unnoticed. But as soon as he stepped inside, he saw Francisco sitting at the kitchen table, his arms crossed, his expression grim. "You lost, didn't you?" Francisco's voice was sharp, cutting through the silence of the room. He didn't even look up from the table. Joao swallowed hard, the taste of defeat still fresh in his mouth. "Yeah, we lost by 1 goal. Francisco shook his head slowly, his disappointment palpable. "I don't know why you keep doing this, Joao. All this running around, playing these silly games. And for what? You think this is going to get you somewhere? You think you'll make a life out of this?" Joao felt the familiar sting of his father's words. He had heard it all before, but it didn't hurt any less now than it had the first time. "I'm trying, Dad. I practice every day. I just want to get better." Francisco stood up from the table, his face tight with frustration. "Get better at what, Joao? Kicking a ball? You think that's going to help this family? We can barely pay the bills. And you're out there wasting your time chasing some dream that'll never happen." Joao's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to argue, to tell his father that soccer wasn't just a game to him. It was his future, his way out. But the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain that to someone who had never believed in dreams? Someone who had given up on his own future long ago? "I'm not wasting my time," Joao said quietly, barely able to meet his father's eyes. Francisco's voice grew louder, his frustration boiling over. "Yes, you are. You're wasting your time and mine. Do you think I like coming home every day from work, covered in dirt, knowing that you're out there kicking a ball instead of helping me? Do you think this is what I want for you?" Joao could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "I'm good at it, Dad. I know I am. Coach say Carlos thinks I could go far. He says I have a chance." Francisco laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. It was bitter, full of years of disappointment and missed opportunities. "A chance? What kind of chance, Joao? The kind that ends with you working construction with me? The kind that leads to a life of struggling just to get by?" Joao clenched his fists, trying to hold back the wave of emotions threatening to spill out. "I don't want that. I don't want to end up like you." The room fell deathly silent. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Joao knew the moment they left his mouth that he had gone too far. Francisco's face hardened, his eyes darkening with a mixture of hurt and anger. He took a step toward Joao, his voice low and cold. "You think you're better than me? You think you're too good for this life? Well, let me tell you something, Joao. Life isn't some game you play with a ball. It's hard. It's painful. And no matter how good you think you are, it'll beat you down just like it beat me down. Joao felt a tear slip down his cheek, but he quickly wiped it away. His father's words stung, but they didn't change how he felt. He didn't want to give up. He couldn't. Francisco turned away. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Tomorrow, you're coming with me to work. No more of this soccer nonsense. It's time for you to grow up. Joao stood frozen, unable to move, his heart shattered. This wasn't just a loss on the field anymore. It was a loss in every sense of the word. His dream had been crushed, not by the other team, but by his own father. Without another word, Joao turned and went to his room, closing the door behind him. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood continued. Kids laughing, dogs barking, life going on as usual. But for Joao, everything had changed. His father's words echoed in his head, over and over again. Life isn't a game. The sun hadn't even risen when Joao felt a hand on his shoulder, gently shaking him awake. His eyes opened groggily to find Francisco standing over him. Already dressed in his work clothes, his face set in a hard line. "Get up. We're leaving in 10 minutes, Francisco said, his voice devoid of warmth. Joao rubbed the sleep from his eyes, feeling the heaviness in his chest from the day before. He had barely slept, the words from their argument still rattling around in his head. He hadn't wanted to believe that his father was serious about taking him to work, but there was no escaping it now. Dragging himself out of bed, Joao threw on a pair of old jeans and a tattered shirt. The idea of spending the entire day working on a construction site felt suffocating. But what choice did he have? Arguing with his father wasn't an option, not after what had been said. They left the house in silence, the streets still dark and empty. Joao followed Francisco down the uneven sidewalk, the cool morning air biting at his skin. He couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted, like a part of his dream had died in their argument. Today, instead of running to practice or heading to a game, he was on his way to a job that he had no interest in, a job that symbolized everything he was trying to escape. The construction site was a few blocks away, a half-built building surrounded by piles of rubble and steel beams. Joao had been here before, but only to drop off lunch for his father on the rare days when his mother could scrape together enough to send him. Today, though, he wasn't here to visit. He was here to work. Francisco handed him a pair of heavy gloves. "You're going to help carry bricks today. It's tough work, but it'll show you what life's really like. Maybe then you'll stop with this soccer nonsense and get serious." Joao didn't respond. He just took the gloves and nodded, swallowing back the resentment that bubbled up inside him. His father didn't understand. He probably never would. As the day wore on, Joao's body began to ache. The sun climbed higher in the sky, baking the dirt beneath his feet as he lugged brick after brick across the site. His arms and back throbbed with each trip, his hands raw despite the gloves. He could feel every muscle in his body screaming in protest, but he pushed through the pain, determined not to show weakness in front of his father. Francisco worked nearby, silent and focused. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this kind of labor for years, his body used to the strain. Joao watched him, wondering how many dreams Francisco had buried under the weight of bricks and mortar. Had his father once been like him, full of hope and ambition, only to have life beat it out of him? At lunchtime, they sat together on a pile of wooden planks, eating sandwiches in silence. Joao stared down at his food, his hands still shaking from the morning's work. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. His father looked out over the site, as if the unfinished building held more answers than he did. Finally, Francisco spoke. "This is what it's like. Joao, this is real life. It's not about dreams or playing games. It's about working hard every day just to survive." Joao swallowed a bite of his sandwich, feeling the lump in his throat. "I know, Dad, but it doesn't have to be like this. Soccer, it could be my way out." Francisco shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. You think soccer's going to save you? That it's some kind of escape? Look around you, Joao. This is reality. No one's going to come along and whisk you away because you can kick a ball. Joao felt his chest tighten. He wanted to argue, to tell his father that he wasn't like the other boys, that he had talent. But how could he convince someone who had never believed in dreams? Someone who saw only the harshness of life, the daily grind of survival? I'm just trying to show you the truth, Francisco continued, his voice softer now. I don't want you to end up like me, Joao, working your whole life for nothing, just scraping by. I want you to have something real, something secure. Soccer isn't that. Joao didn't respond. He didn't know how to make his father see what soccer meant to him, how it wasn't just a game. It was hope. It was possibility. It was the only thing that made him feel alive. The rest of the afternoon dragged on, each hour blending into the next. By the time the sun began to set, Joao was exhausted. His arms felt like lead, his legs barely able to hold him up. But more than the physical exhaustion, it was the emotional weight that pressed down on him. The constant tug-of-war between his dream and his father's expectations was wearing him down. As they walked home that evening, Francisco glanced at his son, his voice quieter than before. You did good today, Joao. You worked hard. That's what it takes to make it in this world. Joao nodded, but inside he felt hollow. He had spent the entire day trying to prove something, but he wasn't sure what. That he could handle the hard work, that he could be the kind of son his father wanted, or maybe, deep down, he had hoped to convince himself that his father was right. But as they approached the house, Joao's eyes drifted to the empty lot where kids were playing soccer, their laughter echoing in the distance. He watched them for a moment, feeling the familiar pull in his chest, the itch in his feet to join them. And in that moment, Joao knew the truth. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried to fit into the mold his father wanted, soccer was a part of him. It wasn't something he could give up, even if his father never understood. The days following his stint at the construction site blurred into a fog of routine. Joao went to school, came home, and helped around the house when he could. His heart wasn't in it, though. His father's words lingered in his mind like an echo that wouldn't fade. He hadn't been back to the soccer field since that day of defeat, and with every passing afternoon, the weight of his father's expectations grew heavier. But then, one Saturday afternoon, while Joao was sitting on the steps of his house, absent-mindedly kicking a small rubber ball against the wall, Zé Carlos appeared, jogging down the street with a sense of urgency. Joao stood up, surprised to see his coach in such a hurry. "Joao," Zé called, his voice filled with excitement as he waved the boy over. Joao jogged toward him, a flicker of hope reigniting in his chest. He hadn't spoken to Zay since the last game, and he had almost convinced himself that his soccer days were behind him. "What's going on, coach?" Joao asked, trying to sound casual despite the rush of nerves that coursed through him. Zay was slightly out of breath as he spoke. "Listen, I know things have been tough for you lately, but I've got some news. There's a scout, a real scout, from one of the big clubs in the city. He's going to be watching a local game next week, and I've been asked to bring a few players to try out." Joao's eyes widened. "A scout? Like a professional team?" Zay nodded, a wide grin spreading across his face. "That's right. This is the kind of opportunity we've been waiting for, Joao. I've seen what you can do. You could impress him. Hell, you could even get a chance to join their youth team." For a moment, Joao's heart soared. This was it, the break he had been dreaming of for so long. But then, as quickly as the excitement filled him, a sense of dread followed. He thought about his father's disapproving look, the long hours they had spent working side by side, and the countless arguments about soccer. "I don't know, coach," Joao said quietly, kicking at the dirt beneath his feet. "I don't think my dad will let me." Zay's expression softened. He had always known about the tension between Joao and his father, but this was bigger than that. "Joao, I get it. Your dad wants what's best for you, but you have to think about what's best for yourself too. This could be your shot. Don't let it slip away because you're afraid of what he'll say. Joao swallowed hard. Deep down, he knew Zay was right, but the thought of going against his father's wishes felt impossible. Francisco had made it clear that soccer wasn't a future he supported, and after their last confrontation, Joao wasn't sure he had the strength to challenge him again. "Think about it," Zay said, placing a hand on Joao's shoulder. "You've got time. The game is next week, and I want you there. But it's your decision." Joao nodded, watching as Zay jogged back down the street. He stood there for a long time, his mind spinning with possibilities. A scout, a real chance to play for a professional team. It was everything he had ever wanted. But now that the opportunity was in front of him, all he could think about was his father's voice telling him that soccer was a waste of time. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. Joao could barely concentrate on anything. The excitement of the scouts' visit clashed with the weight of his father's disapproval, making it hard to think straight. He found himself rehearsing conversations with his father in his head, trying to find the right words to explain why this chance was so important. But every time, he hit a wall. Nothing he said in his mind seemed like it would be enough to convince Francisco. By the time Monday rolled around, Joao still hadn't told his father about the scout or the upcoming game. He had tried a dozen times, sitting across from Francisco at the dinner table, opening his mouth to speak, but the words always died before they could leave his lips. Tuesday and Wednesday passed much the same way. Joao would come home from school, help with the chores, and try to muster the courage to talk to his dad, but the fear of rejection held him back. Then, on Thursday afternoon, Joao made a decision. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away, even if it meant disappointing his father. He couldn't spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. He had to go to that game. He had to try. That evening, as he helped Francisco clean up after dinner, Joao finally spoke up. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice hesitant. Francisco glanced over at him, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" Joao took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Coach Zay Carlos, he told me there's a scout coming to watch a game this weekend. A scout from one of the big teams in the city. He wants me to play." Francisco's expression darkened immediately. "A scout? For soccer?" "Joao, we've talked about this." "I know, Dad," Joao interrupted, his heart racing. "But this is different. This could be my chance. My one shot to make something of myself with soccer. You don't understand, Francisco cut him off, his voice rising. "I understand perfectly. You think some stranger is going to come along and change your life just because you can kick a ball around. You need to stop chasing these dreams and focus on what's real, Joao. Life doesn't work like that." Joao's hands clenched into fists at his sides, frustration boiling inside him. "But Dad, this is real. Coach Zay believes in me. He thinks I can go far. Why can't you see that?" Francisco shook his head, his expression hardening. "Because I know what it's like to have dreams, Joao. I know how quickly they can disappear." Joao stood there, silent, his heart sinking. His father wasn't going to change his mind. He never would. But this time, Joao wasn't backing down. He couldn't. "I'm going to that game," Joao said quietly but firmly. Francisco stared at him for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. "Do what you want, Joao, but don't come crying to me when it all falls apart." The sun beat down hard on the dusty field as Joao laced up his shoes, his hands trembling slightly with nerves. He had never been this anxious before a game. But this wasn't just any game, it was the game, the one that could change everything. The scout was already here, sitting on the far side of the field, his clipboard in hand, watching every player's move. Joao tried to block out the noise, the pressure, and the weight of what this opportunity meant. He focused on the ball at his feet, letting the rhythm of the game pull him in, the way it always did. His heart raced, but he reminded himself to breathe, to stay calm. "This is what you've been waiting for," he thought, as the whistle blew. Joao charged forward, his legs moving before his mind could catch up. He darted through the defense, his feet dancing over the ball, dodging opponents with precision. Every movement felt sharper, more intentional than ever before. Joao knew he couldn't afford any mistakes. Within minutes, the ball was at his feet in the midfield and he spotted an opening his teammate clear on the right wing. Without hesitating, Joao sent a perfect pass soaring across the field. The crowd cheered as his teammate controlled the ball and sent it into the net, scoring the first goal. But Joao barely noticed the applause. He was in the zone, locked into the rhythm of the game. For the first time in what felt like weeks, he wasn't thinking about his father, the arguments, or the crushing pressure to prove himself. It was just him in the game, the ball at his feet, and the goal ahead. As the match wore on, Joao could feel the eyes of the scout on him, watching his every move. He pushed himself harder than ever, sprinting down the field, cutting through defenders, and setting up plays for his teammates. Every pass, every touch on the ball felt like it mattered more than it ever had before. And then it happened, late in the second half. With the score tied at 1-1, Joao saw his chance. He intercepted a loose ball at midfield and took off, sprinting toward the goal. Two defenders closed in on him, but Joao's feet were too quick. He dribbled past one, then faked out the second with a sharp turn, leaving both players in the dust. Now, it was just Joao and the goalkeeper. Time seemed to slow as he approached the box, his eyes locked on the goal. He took a deep breath, planted his foot, and struck the ball with everything he had. The sound of the ball hitting the net was like music to his ears. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Joao's teammates swarmed him, celebrating the go-ahead goal. But as Joao caught his breath, he noticed someone actually out of the corner of his eye. Standing at the edge of the field, just beyond the crowd, was his father. Joao's heart skipped a beat. Francisco wasn't supposed to be here. He had made it clear that soccer was a waste of time, that Joao's dreams would only lead to disappointment. So, why was he standing there now, watching? Joao tried to shake the thought from his mind and focus on the game, but it was impossible. His father's presence weighed on him like an anchor, pulling him out of the moment. Was he angry, disappointed, or something else entirely? As the final whistle blew, Joao felt a surge of relief and exhaustion wash over him. His team had won 2-1, and he had scored the winning goal. But all of that seemed secondary now. The only thing Joao could think about was the fact that his father had shown up. The scout was talking to Zé Carlos on the sideline, jotting down notes on his clipboard, but Joao barely noticed. His eyes were locked on Francisco, who stood motionless, his expression unreadable. Joao's heart pounded in his chest as he walked over to his father, unsure of what to expect. Part of him wanted to turn back, to avoid whatever conversation was about to happen, but he knew he couldn't. Not now. When he finally reached him, Joao could barely find his voice. "Dad, I didn't know you were coming." Francisco looked down at his son, his face still impassive. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he spoke. "I wasn't planning to," Francisco said quietly, "but I passed by on my way home from work, and I saw you." Joao nodded, unsure of what to say. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, to fill the silence between them. "You played well," Francisco added after a pause. His voice was gruff, but there was something different in it, something Joao hadn't heard before. That goal, that was something. Joao blinked, not sure if he had heard his father right. For years, all he had wanted was for Francisco to notice his talent, to see that soccer wasn't just a game to him. And now, here he was, standing in front of him, acknowledging his skill for the first time. "I've always told you to focus on what's real," Francisco continued, his voice low. "I thought soccer was just a distraction, a way to avoid the hard work that life demands. But after watching you today," he trailed off, his eyes meeting Joao's for the first time. There was something in his expression that Joao had never seen before, pride. "I see now that it's more than that," Francisco said, his voice softening. "You've got something, Joao. I didn't want to admit it, but I'm proud of you." Joao's chest tightened, his heart swelling with emotions he didn't know how to express. He had spent years trying to earn those words, to prove to his father that soccer wasn't a waste of time. And now, finally, he had. For a moment, they stood in silence, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. Joao could feel the weight of everything that had come before, every argument, every disappointment lifting just a little. "Thanks, Dad," Joao said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Francisco nodded, clearing his throat. "I'm not saying I understand everything about this soccer thing, but I see how much it means to you. And if this is what you want, then I'll support you." Joao couldn't hold back the smile that spread across his face. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he wasn't just chasing a dream alone. They stood there for a few more moments, the air between them lighter than it had been in years. Joao knew that his father wasn't going to change overnight, but this was a start, a step in the right direction. As they turned to leave the field, Joao glanced back at Zé Carlos and the scout, still deep in conversation. His heart raced with the excitement of what might come next, but for now, he was content. He had won more than just a game today. The car ride home was quiet, but the tension that usually filled the air between Joao and Francisco had loosened. There was still a lot left unsaid, but something had changed after that game. Joao could feel it in the way his father's hands gripped the steering wheel. Not as tight, not as frustrated. It was as if a barrier between them had finally begun to crack. When they got home, Joao expected his father to retreat to the kitchen or disappear into the living room like usual. Instead, Francisco stood by the door for a moment, then gestured for Joao to sit with him at the table. Joao felt a pang of nervousness in his stomach, unsure where this conversation was going to lead. They sat across from each other, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. Joao could feel his heart racing in his chest, his palms slightly sweaty. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected his father to actually want to talk. "I've been thinking," Francisco began, his voice quieter than Joao was used to, "about today and everything else." Joao swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "Yeah." Francisco nodded slowly. He seemed to be searching for the right words, something Joao had rarely seen him do. "You're a good kid, Joao. I see that now. I know I haven't always made it easy for you with the soccer and all. He paused, rubbing his hands together, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of what he was about to say. "I just didn't want you to end up like me." The admission hit Joao harder than he expected. He had always known that his father carried a lot of disappointment and regret, but hearing it out loud was something else entirely. He could see the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the dreams that had been abandoned. "I know, Dad," Joao said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm not you. I'm not saying that I don't respect what you've done for us, for the family. It's just..." He hesitated, unsure of how to put everything he felt into words. He had spent so long trying to prove himself, but now that he had the chance to explain, it was harder than he thought. "Soccer, it's the one thing that makes me feel like I'm good at something," Joao continued, looking down at his hands. "I don't know if I'm going to make it. I don't know if the scout will even care about me after today. But I have to try. I can't just give it up. Not without knowing." Francisco was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Joao could see the struggle in his father's face, the internal battle between wanting to protect him and wanting to let him follow his own path. "I wanted to protect you from disappointment," Francisco said, his voice softer now. "I didn't want you to chase something that might not happen. I've seen too many dreams get crushed by reality, and it's not an easy thing to watch, especially when it's your own son." Joao's chest tightened at his father's words. He had spent so long thinking that Francisco was just trying to stop him, to hold him back. But now, he was starting to understand that it had never been about control. It had been about fear. Fear of seeing his son face the same kind of disappointment that had haunted Francisco his whole life. "I get that, Dad," Joao said quietly, "but I can handle it. I know it's not going to be easy. I know there's a chance I won't make it. But I'd rather try and fail than spend the rest of my life wondering what could have happened." Francisco's eyes softened, and for the first time, Joao saw a flicker of understanding there. He wasn't sure if his father would ever fully support his dream, but this was a start. At least now, they were on the same page. "Your coach, Zé Carlos, he seems to believe in you," Francisco said after a long pause. Joao nodded. "Yeah, he does." Francisco leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "And you believe in yourself?" The question caught Joao off guard. He had spent so much time trying to convince his father that he hadn't really thought about how he felt deep down. But now, sitting across from Francisco, the answer came to him clearly. "I do," Joao said firmly, meeting his father's gaze. "I really do." Francisco studied his son for a long moment, as if seeing him for the first time. Then, with a slow nod, he sighed deeply. "All right, Joao. If this is what you want, if this is what you really want, I'll support you." Joao blinked, unsure if he had heard his father correctly. You will." Francisco nodded again, more certain this time. "Yeah, I may not understand it, but I see how much it means to you. I don't want you to give up on something that makes you happy. Just promise me you'll be careful. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." Joao felt a wave of relief wash over him, a tension lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't standing on opposite sides from his father. They were finally in this together. "I will, Dad," Joao said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise." Francisco gave him a small smile, one that seemed almost foreign on his usually stern face. "Good. Now let's see what the scout says, huh?" Joao couldn't help but grin. The future was still uncertain, and there were no guarantees about what would happen next, but for the first time, he felt like he had a real shot. And that was enough. The morning of Joao's tryout arrived sooner than he expected. His stomach churned with a mix of excitement and nerves as he tied his worn-out shoes for what felt like the 100th time. Today was the day. Everything he had worked for, all the hours spent practicing on that dusty field, had led to this moment. Outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm, golden glow over the streets. Joao could hear the faint sound of kids already playing soccer in the neighborhood, their laughter drifting through the air. But today, Joao wasn't joining them. Today, he was headed somewhere else, somewhere bigger. As he stood up to leave, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find his father, Francisco, standing there. He was dressed in his work clothes as usual, but there was something different in his eyes. Something softer. "You ready?" Francisco asked, his voice quiet but steady. Joao nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah, I think so." Francisco gave him a small nod, his expression unreadable. "I'll be there," he said, almost as an afterthought. Joao's eyes widened in surprise. "You're coming?" Francisco shrugged, looking a little uncomfortable. "Yeah, figured I should see for myself what all this fuss is about." A smile tugged at the corners of Joao's mouth. His father didn't say much, but the fact that he was coming to watch the tryout meant more to Joao than he could put into words. It was a sign, proof that things were changing between them. The ride to the tryout felt like it took forever, even though the club was only a short drive away. Joao stared out the window, trying to calm his nerves. He had been practicing for this moment for years, but now that it was here, the weight of it all pressed down on him. When they arrived at the training facility, Joao was greeted by the sight of pristine, manicured fields. It was nothing like the rough, uneven terrain he was used to playing on back home. The other boys were already warming up, all of them dressed in crisp, new uniforms that made Joao feel a little out of place in his old, worn-out clothes. But as soon as he stepped onto the field, that feeling melted away. Here, it didn't matter what he was wearing. It didn't matter where he came from. All that mattered was the ball at his feet and what he could do with it. The tryout began with drills, simple things like passing, dribbling, and shooting. Joao moved through them with ease, his body remembering the hours of practice, the endless afternoons spent kicking a ball against the wall. He could feel the eyes of the coaches and scouts on him, watching his every move. As the tryout progressed, Joao started to relax. The nerves that had been eating at him all morning faded away, replaced by a familiar sense of focus. He was in his element now, doing what he loved more than anything else in the world. By the time the scrimmage started, Joao had found his rhythm. He moved effortlessly across the field, passing the ball with precision, cutting through defenders with ease. He even managed to score a goal, sending the ball sailing into the top corner of the net. His teammates cheered, but Joao barely heard them. His eyes searched the sidelines for one person in particular. There, standing just beyond the crowd, was Francisco. Joao couldn't read his father's expression, but he didn't need to. The fact that Francisco was there, watching, was enough. It gave Joao the extra boost of confidence he needed to keep pushing, to give everything he had. The scrimmage ended, and Joao walked off the field, his legs aching with exhaustion but his heart soaring. The scouts huddled together, whispering among themselves, while the boys gathered their things and waited for the verdict. Joao glanced over at Francisco, who was standing a little ways off, watching quietly. He wanted to run over and ask what his father thought of the game, but he held back, unsure of what to say. After everything that had happened between them, Joao knew this was a delicate moment. He didn't want to ruin it. Finally, one of the scouts approached Joao and Zé Carlos, a clipboard in hand and a serious expression on his face. "You've got talent, kid," the scout said, nodding at Joao. "There's still a lot of work to be done, but we're interested in having you come back for further evaluation." How does that sound? Joao's heart skipped a beat. Really? I can come back? The scout smiled slightly. Yes, really. But, like I said, it's just the beginning. There's a long road ahead. Think you're up for it? Joao didn't even hesitate. Yes, I'm up for it. As the scout walked away, Zé Carlos clapped a hand on Joao's shoulder, his face beaming with pride. "I knew you had it in you, Joao. This is just the start. Keep working hard. And who knows where it could lead." Joao nodded, a huge grin spreading across his face. He couldn't believe it. This was his shot, his chance to make something of himself through soccer. And while it wasn't a guarantee, it was more than enough to keep his dream alive. When the crowd started to thin, Joao walked over to where Francisco was standing. His father didn't say anything at first, just looked him up and down with an unreadable expression. "So," Francisco said after a long pause, "looks like you've got a shot." Joao nodded. "Yeah, they want me to come back for more training." Francisco's gaze lingered on his son for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "You did good today, Joao." The words hit Joao harder than he expected. He had waited so long to hear something like that from his father, and now that he had, it felt like a weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. "Thanks, Dad," Joao said, his voice thick with emotion. Francisco gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You've got a long road ahead of you, you know that, right?" Joao nodded. "Yeah, I know." "Good," Francisco said, "because I'll be there. Whatever happens, I'll be there." And for the first time in a long time, Joao felt like he wasn't chasing his dream alone.